Now we will talk about international perspectives on who provides troops for US peace operations. A total of 107 countries contribute forces to UN peace operations. With all those peacekeeping and related missions around the world, who is it that is providing the troops? Contrary to what many believe, the United States ranks the world in the number of military troops and police provided for UN peacekeeping missions. Of the 71,811 military troops and police deployed in the 15 UN peace operations as of January 2006, only 370 were American. The top 10 countries are Bangladesh supplies 10,154, in Pakistan 9,516, India 7,339, Jordan 3,731, Nepal 3,571, Ethiopia 3,412, Uruguay 2,611, Ghana 2,522, Nigeria 2,437, and South Africa 1,999, 95 troops. So this is the list of UN peace troops, peacekeeping operations across the world. So today we will talk about UN military peace operations. But before going to talk about UN military peace operations, we will also talk about the 1999 Kosovo War. In the Kosovo War, the United States and NATO are victorious, but with mixed lessons. The Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic and his forces were defeated and forced to withdraw from Kosovo, but not until ethnic violence had taken a heavy toll. One of the points critics raise is that Operation Allied Force could have prevailed more quickly and more overwhelmingly, and with less ethnically, had the United States been willing to send in ground troops as well as launching airstrikes. Concerned that casualty phobia would undermine American public support. However, President Clinton had stated from the start that ground troops are off the table. At a minimum, critics argue the ground troops option should have been left open as a threat for racketing of our effort that could have coerced Milosevic into surrendering sooner. Similarly, mixed lessons came from Kosovo as a case of war by alliance. This was the first time NATO had fought a war. It had trained, prepared, positioned, and formulated strategies for war throughout the Cold War, but had never had to actually fight one. To its credit, NATO did hold together politically and did carry out generally well coordinated and effectively executed military operations in Kosovo. But this did not happen without political pulling and tugging. As the British scholar Michael Cox put it, friends are politically necessary but militarily problematic. Within a general consensus of common interest in defending Kosovo, different NATO members had different particular interests at stake. Yet, NATO decision making rules required unanimity or at least no dissenting votes. Some states might choose to abstain. Some in the United States saw the internal NATO politics as bothersome and cumbersome, getting in the way of military planning. So, although the dominant lesson of Kosovo was that NATO did succeed in its first war, that success did have its qualifiers. Now, we will talk about UN military peace operations. As for the United Nations, it has a long history of peacekeeping and humanitarian intervention that reaches back to 1948 and includes cases in the Middle East, India and Pakistan, the Congo, Cyprus, the 1980s Iran-Iraq war, and the 1988 to 90 Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. Amid the controversies over more recent cases such as Somalia and Bosnia, the UN's peacekeeping success often get forgotten. Indeed, the record was so strong that the UN peacekeeping forces received the 1988 Nobel Peace Prize. Whereas the UN had undertaken only 13 peacekeeping missions prior to 1988, since then more than 55 new missions had been initiated. The number of UN peacekeeping troops shot up from 9,570 in 1988 to 73,393 in 1994. UN peacekeeping budgets went from $230 million to $3.6 billion. These huge and simultaneous increases of operations made for an enormous agenda, especially for an institution with so little of the military infrastructure of command and control, communications, intelligence, training, and logistics. Furthermore, the structure of decision-making authority often proved too slow and indecisive either to carry out complex and speedy military operations or to convey credibility to an aggressor. Additionally, all of these peace operations involved soldiers assembled on a contemporary basis from the national armies of UN member countries. The original idea that the UN would have its own standing army of troops and officers assigned to it on an ongoing basis was never realized, as was discussed earlier. Each time there is need for a peace operation, it is necessary to assemble a new force. This adds to the problems of timely response until cohesiveness and effective training. International perspectives list some of the countries these forces come from that I have already at the outset of my video I told about this. The more fundamental problem has been the difference in missions between peacekeeping and peace enforcing. Most of the first generation UN successes had been peacekeeping missions. In these situations, the UN forces are brought in after the parties have agreed to the terms of peace and with the consent of those parties. To ensure and facilitate the keeping of that peace, the peacekeepers' rules of engagement are neutral and impartial, to use force only for their own self-defense and not to interfere in the internal affairs of the parties. The UN had some further successes in the late 1980s, early 1990s in Namibia, Mozambique, El Salvador, and Cambodia in second generation peacekeeping. In straight cases that involve elections and other aspects of nation building, cases such as Bosnia, though are much more about peacekeeping and peace enforcing, in that the conflicts are still raging or at best under tenuous ceasefires, conditions in which traditional stratagems of impartiality and limited missions are not sufficient. There was no peace to be kept. It had to be imposed and enforced. To the extent that the parties had reached any agreements, they were but partial ones, holding actions, gambits, even outright deceptions. In such situations, the United Nations limited rules of engagement do not work very well. Neutrality and impartiality can neutrality neutrality and impartiality can let aggressors off the hook. Even a Nobel laureate method will not succeed when applied to purposes as fundamentally different as peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace enforcing. By late 1995, even UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali was acknowledging that peace enforcement is beyond the power of the UN. In the future, if peace enforcement is needed, it should be conducted by countries with the will to do it. Along these lines, one recent study of major 1990s cases showed that interventions that directly challenge the perpetrator or aid the target of the brutal policy are the only effective type of military responses, increasing the probability that the magnitude of the slaughter can be slowed or stopped. Even given these problems, the UN has been more successful than it is often given credit for. A study by the Rand Corporation, a think tank with close links to the Pentagon, shows that the UN was more successful in some respects than the United States. Another study qualifies this finding, emphasizing that the UN's capacity varies according to the nature of the mission, that the UN is both structurally ill-equipped and unlikely to ever obtain the requisite political support to undertake, that is, to plan, mount, direct, and sustain enforcement operations. Lately, concern also has been mounting about overtaxation, overextension in the sheer number of missions on the UN docket. With the lessons of the early 1990s overload in numbers as well as types of missions in mind, the UN's new peace building commission can help with political, diplomatic, and economic strategies. But the UN still also needs greater military intervention, credibility, and capacity. And this aspect of strategy remains highly controversial, becoming an issue within American domestic politics. As we look ahead, we do see some positive signs. The 2005 Human Security Report showed declines in both the number and the lethality of ethnic and related conflicts. Some old conflicts are resolved, others are moving toward peace and stability. But then there was Darfur, the region of Sudan, where mass killings were taking place, and the United States, the United Nations, and others in the international community did very little and very late. Okay, we will talk about Darfur, and it is yet again. The video is going to be a long one. I hope you do listen to it carefully and you will enjoy listening to this. As many as 400,000 dead, that means 4 lakh people dead. More than 2 million in internal refugee camps and across the border in Chad. Chad is another African country. Chad. Countless villages burnt or otherwise devastated. As one indication that the crisis was growing even worse, the World Food Programme had to raise its appeal from its January 2005 level of food for 2.8 million people to 3.5 million in June, amounting to more than half of Darfur's pre-conflict population. The violence continues. Deputy Secretary of the State Robert Zoelik was told during a November 2005 visit, indeed, with all the villages burnt, the Janjaweed had taken to attacking the refugee camps, making even these locals unsafe. Like so many other cases, uh, although not fully preventable, Darfur was containable well short of the tragic dimensions it raised. Key signs of another missed opportunity were there. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the devastating 1980s drought that left the various tribal and religious groups competing for shrinking resources of water, grassland, and arable soil. But what turned this ecological limited conflict into mass killings were the Arabization policies of the Khartoum government. These policies intensified and radicalized parts of the anti-government insurgency in Darfur, which did pose a threat. Mostly, though, the insurgency provided an excuse for the Sudanese government to team up with Arab tribesmen. The tribesmen were dubbed Janabid from an old epithet of devils on horseback. Documents captured by the African Union peacekeeping force showed the direct complicity of the Sudanese government. As reported by the New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, one document directed to regional commanders and security officials calls for the execution of all directives from the President of the Republic, change the demography of Darfur and make it void of African tribes by killing, burning villages and farms, terrorizing people, confiscating property from members of African tribes, and forcing them from Darfur. Although some details surfaced only over time, the first warning went back to early 2003, where Darfur refugees escaping to Chad were reporting the scorched earth attacks of the Sudanese army and the Janjaweed. By December 2003, close to 100,000 refugees were in Chad, where UN agencies, NGOs, and journalists finally were able to get into Darfur in early 2004. The scope and scale of the conflict was very, very heavily reported after seeing for themselves. Both Secretary General Annan and Secretary of State Colin Powell used the term genocide. So did President Bush in his own statement and the US Congress in a condemnatory resolution. But the Janjaweed militias continued to kill, rape, and destroy with the Sudanese government support and complicity. The international community did little, and what it did do was too weak to be effective. An opportunity came when Shah led negotiations in 2003 to apply pressure on Khartoum, but attention was concentrated almost entirely on humanitarian relief and not the underlying political issues fueling the crisis. The UN Security Council did pass a number of resolutions, but they were weak and their deadlines were not enforced. UNSC 1547 June 11, 2004 focused mostly on southern Sudan with only brief mention of Darfur. UNSC 1556 July 30 was tough in its rhetoric, giving Khartoum 30 days to disarm the Janjaweed and invoking a Chapter 7 mandate to intervene based on threats to international peace and security. But the resolution was more words than action. The UN was more than happy to delegate to the African Union, which was pushing for an African solution to an African problem, to take the lead on a peacekeeping force. The Security Council authorized the African Union mission in Sudan, AMIS, but with too limited a mandate to be effective. Nor did the UNSC invoke economic sanctions, saying only that it would consider further actions. When the 30-day deadline was not met, the UN special envoy signed on to a plan of action with Khartoum that lacked solid benchmarks and to some observers looked more like an escape route than a discipline upon the government. UNSC 1564 September 18 established a commission of inquiry, but once again did little more than reiterate possible future action. UNSC 1574 November 19 authorized an increase in the size of AMIS and some extension of its mandate, but again failed to demand specific actions, imposed no deadlines, and made no explicit or specific threats of consequences. UNSC 1591, March 29, 2005, again deplored and again demanded, but again took limited action. In this instance, no more than targeted sanctions such as banning travel by and freezing assets of key perpetrators. One, of course, a commission that would meet over the ensuing months decided who they were. Yet an international crisis group report showed continued Sudanese government financing of the Janjaweed, and a UN High Commissioner for Refugees report documented rape and gang rape being perpetrated by Sudanese armed forces and law enforcement agencies. The message to the aggressors is in the limits, not the escape of such actions. They know what they are doing, what conditions they are not complying with, what deadlines they are not meeting. Opponents may claim to be sending a tough or toughening message, but the message as received is devoid of credibility. Opposition from Russia and China was a main reason for the limits and weaknesses of the UN action. Their positions in part reflected similar strict constructionism regarding sovereignty as over Kosovo, and in part their economic interest. Russia actually completed a sale of military aircraft and the same aircraft that were being used to bomb villages in Darfur, even as Security Council members deliberated over how to address the crisis. For China, the issue was Sudanese oil. Sudan was part of China's global hunt for energy. As of 2004, Sudan was supplying 6% of China's oil needs, with projections very much on an upward curve. China also had approximately 3 billion US dollars invested in Sudan's oil sector, had been awarded hundreds of millions of dollars in additional contracts for the construction of pipelines and port facilities, and was the principal financer of a 200 million US dollars hydroelectric plant. To get China even to abstain, the UNSC resolution had to be watered down. Even the limited pledges of humanitarian assistance that had been made were going unfulfilled. The UN appeal for 693 million US dollars in the first half of 2005 brought in only 358 US million dollars. The United States was the largest donor at 252 million US dollars plus another 100 billion US dollars for relief efforts elsewhere in Sudan. Britain was second at 36 million US dollars plus another 50 billion US dollars for the rest of Sudan. Japan only gave 7.9 million US dollars, Germany 4.2 million US dollars, France 1.8 million. Only two fellow Muslim countries even made the list of the top 18 donors. The Arab League saw fit to hold its March 2006 summit in Khartoum, at which it once again showed more support for than outrage with the Sudanese government. Osama bin Laden called for jihadists to go to Sudan to fight any effort the West might make to stop these mass killings of Muslims. By this logic, the jihadists would be killing other Muslims based on other UN peace operations. Most of the troops likely will be from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Jordan, who are seeking to protect the Muslim people who have already suffered over 400,000 deaths or 4 lakh deaths. Although the African Union deserves credit for taking on the humanitarian mission, its role has reflected three of the major dilemmas in many humanitarian intervention cases. First is the discrepancy between the nature of the mission and the mandate and resources for achieving it. AMIS started in April 2004 as only a ceasefire monitoring mission, not an enforcement one. And with only 120 monitors spread across a vast territory, it became a true presence later that year, building up to about 7,700 by October 2005 with a goal of 12,300 by spring 2006. But it wasn't able to build capacity to that level. Moreover, its mandate remained largely one of monitoring and forcing self-protection. The aid, training, and support the United States, Western Europe, and others placed slowly and only partially materialized. Sensing this weakness and calculating that aggression against the existing AMIS forces would deter more than foster expanded deployments, the Sudanese government and Janjaweed forces ambushed AMIS forces on October 8, 2005, killing 6. The next day, an entire AMSI patrol of 18 was kidnapped, and then a rescue mission of 20 was also captured. Second has been the EAU's own ambivalence to step up fully to its own charter's commitment to collective intervention. The final communique of its October 2004 mini summit reaffirmed support for Sudan's government, rejecting any foreign intervention by any country whatsoever. This tension grew even more problematic when Sudan was scheduled to rotate to the UAU presidency in 2006. This move was blocked, but the tacit keyed pro-Q was an AU resolution that leaned much more toward the traditional conception of sovereignty and its restrictions on intervention than toward responsibility to protect. So this is not all about the Sudan or Darfur crisis. I would like to put an end to this video, and in our next video we will talk about the details of the Darfur crisis of Sudan. So thank you once again for your kind and patient hearing. I hope you all have enjoyed listening to this. Thank you. Bye-bye.